All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I've got another very, very special guest with me today. He covers all of Chicago sports across all the major teams and has worked for a number of Chicago sports organizations. He's often the first really to break the major news that pertains to the Bulls. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Daniel Greenberg. Daniel, thanks for being on the show, man.
Thank you for having me.
So, Daniel, again, I know we just talked about a little bit offline, but really thanks again for taking the time out of your day to have this interview with me. I do very much appreciate it. For me, it's always an incredible experience just being able to talk to, folks like yourself in the industry and getting sort of that insider view and what's going on around the organization. Know that you cover all of the major Chicago sports, but I'll mainly just be focusing on the Bulls today. But I did want to start off because I asked Casey Johnson this as well. I'm always just curious, what sort of got you into this field of work, and how'd you end up where you are right now?
Yeah, so I've always had a passion for sports in general, but Chicago sports, I live in Chicago. I love Chicago sports. And, I've always had like strong opinions about like games, especially Bulls games, because I'm very passionate about the Chicago Bulls, and just created a Twitter for it. And then it turned into a huge thing now. So yeah, I'm very passionate about sports, and it's something that every day I always check Twitter, just other outlets, because like I can't stop like seeing what's going on.
I'm the same way. I'm always like updating my Twitter feed and it's wanting to see what the latest news is. A lot of times it can be kind of hard to really separate fact from fiction. But you've obviously been covering Chicago sports for a long time. I've got all these Bulls related questions. I know that you cover the Bulls, the Cubs, White Sox, Bears, Blackhawks, all of that. Is there any particular team that you're more partial to than others? And it's okay if you don't say the Bulls. I won't be offended. I'm always just curious.
Yeah, I always tell my closest friends that the Chicago Bulls are number one for me, and the rest of the teams are number two. It's just Bulls games, like just Bulls news. There's always something going on, and it's always entertaining, and I just love it a lot.
I like it. It. So I actually want to start with the most recent Bulls news that you first broke regarding Marco Simonovich, which hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly, signing with the Bulls, after playing overseas for a year. He was a draft and stash player, that second-round pick in 2020. What can you tell us about the decision to bring over Simonovich and what he can really bring to this Bulls team going into next season?
Yeah, so he's actually been in Chicago for the last several days. So he's in the city. They've agreed to terms with his camp and the Bulls. The thing that he'll bring is, well, one, he played with kind of like how Luka from Dallas played.
Yeah.
He played with grown men, so he didn't play like in college with like a bunch of kids that are not going to be in the NBA. He played with a lot of former NBA players, a lot of European big talents over there. So he produced big time. He had a lot of really good games this season in the ABA league. What he'll bring, a lot of people compare him to like Lauri Markkanen. I think he's more of an aggressive player. He's a guy that will get you a rebound on the defensive side, and he'll get the ball all the way into the offensive side within a couple of seconds. He's a pace kind of guy. He likes to run the floor. It looks like he never gets tired. He can score out of nowhere. He can get you 9 points within a couple like minutes. I think he's a really good player, and a guy. I don't see him starting for the Bulls right away, but he's a guy like on the bench mob that can come in the second unit and provide that scoring for you, and also that defensive like rebound and offensive rebounds.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, I hear a lot of people saying that, right? It's like he's the Lauri Markkanen 2.0, where he's going to be the Lauri Markkanen replacement. I do think that, it can be a bit premature to say that. And the only reason I say that is because, Simonovich, like you said, he is playing with grown men. This isn't like he's coming from college. He's playing in a professional league. At the same time, though, Lauri Markkanen is as much as, he's struggled these past couple of seasons. I know a lot of Bulls fans have been really critical of him. He's still a lottery pick, and he's still a very incredible player. It's just these last couple of seasons, he's just really had a hard time kind of finding himself with this team, especially after the Vucevic trade. Do you think that this decision to bring in Simonovich is a sign that the Bulls are likely going to be moving on from Markkanen, or potentially unable to retain even Tice or even move on from Thaddeus Young. I mean, it's sort of a indication that, we need to bring in Simonovich as a big man, because we're kind of not sure of the uncertain future of these other guys that we have.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think they're just unsure, and it's more of like a security blanket for them, just in case, because free agency is always crazy. You never know what's going to happen.
Right.
So just for them to know that we got Marco on the team, like he's a guy that he could fill in that hole that Lauri played in. But again, you never know. So I think it's more like of a security blanket, like we got this guy on the team, like that's one step down. Not when free agency happens, like Lauri is gone and then we don't have anyone to back like that position. So just for them to know they got Marco on the team, and if anything happens, we know that he's good to go on there.
Sure. So Rob Schaefer recently met with Zach Levine for a one-on-one interview that aired on Friday in the Bulls Talk podcast. And, he shared some tidbits. You shared some tidbits from that interview on your Twitter feed. Now, I listened to that podcast, which was a great interview. I always love those, one-on-one interviews that these guys do. I much prefer that over like a post or pre-game presser. There was talk about his contract extension and sort of the looming question around that, which obviously Zach isn't going to share much on that, because that's going to be between him and his agent, the front office. But I did find it reassuring that he does want to stay with the Bulls long term and that he's committed to Chicago. Granted, a lot of players say that and then sometimes they end up leaving, but Levine comes off to me as a guy that really values loyalty. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think about his contract extension and how it will play out. Obviously, there are options which we can discuss, but what's sort of the latest that you're hearing regarding his contract extension?
Yeah, well, I would say that that podcast with Rob, that was a really good podcast. And if you listen to like his voice, he's actually like genuine about it. Like he's not just faking it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So he has said multiple times that he wants to be with the Chicago Bulls long term. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Bulls offer him a contract extension. Not sure if he'll accept it or deny it, but for him to say that he wants to be here long term, and when he talked to the media for USA Basketball, he said that he expects his side and the Bulls to meet soon about it. Obviously, he's very interested in staying here long term, which is good news. Will it get done? I'm not sure, but hopefully in the near future it will get done, and something will happen between those two sides, because Arturis and the Mark obviously are big fans of his, and they were very impressed with how he played this season. And when you got a player that wants to be here long term, there's always something that can work out.
Yeah, and it's funny because I see a lot of people on my videos commenting on the channel around Zach Levine's going to take a discount for Chicago. He's hinted at that, and I'm kind of just taking a step back and like, I really don't see that happening. And it's no fault to Zach. I don't think that he should take a discount. If anything, he's really kind of been taking a discount in pay these last couple seasons with the amount that he's getting paid, with the level of production he's been providing. Do you see there being any way that he doesn't take a max contract?
If he doesn't take a max contract, then the Bulls got very lucky.
Yeah.
If I was him, I would definitely get that. I mean, he deserves it. With his statistics, he deserves like a big time contract because he has gone underpaid a lot. But I would say this, that with the Chicago Bulls, he loves the city a lot. His family loves the city. He loves playing for the Bulls. With them making that trade and the trade deadline for Nikola Vucevic, it showed Zach that, look, this team is very serious about winning. And, maybe that because the last couple of years, the Bulls have been pretty bad. So it showed that, this is a new page, and hopefully in the next couple of years that the Bulls will be back in the playoffs and competing for a championship.
Yeah, I think that was a good indicator to Levine that, first of all, this new front office, they mean business and they're willing to build around him. I don't think he was really getting that, before from the front office. Yeah. Now, switching gears a little bit, I actually talked to Casey Johnson about this a little bit, and it's a common topic among Bulls fans. Obviously, the focus of this offseason for the Bulls is figuring out how they can upgrade at the point guard position. That's sort of just the the talk around the Bulls organization, whether it's the fans, the media. And of course, it was recently announced in The Athletic that the Sixers are now opening to trade talks of offers for Ben Simmons. And I have to talk about Ben Simmons because I have my thoughts on it, which I'll share. But what have you heard recently on any rumors or even the possibility of a potential for the Bulls making a trade for Ben Simmons?
Yeah, I don't understand it, to be honest with you. It doesn't make sense to me at all because I think it'll actually make the team worse.
Okay.
I don't think he's a guy that fits Zach Levine and Nikola Vucevic and Patrick Williams. So I really don't see it happening. I would be stunned if anything Ben Simmons to the Bulls would happen. I think they need more of a different kind of point guard than the one that Ben Simmons provides to the court.
Yeah, so I'm the opposite of you, man. I think that Ben Simmons fits really well with the team. The only thing is, and granted, you know, I'm not a professional basketball analyst by any means, so I'm sure there's a lot of things that I'm overlooking. But the only thing that I see it is, as long as you aren't trading Lavine or Vucevic or even Patrick Williams, I think that this trade makes sense. The only reason I say that is because I think Simmons in a new environment, surrounded by shooters like Levine and Vucevic, guys that can actually score, and a team that needs elite level defense, especially when it comes to perimeter defense, that could be a game changer. And again, obviously there's a lot of flaws with Simmons. The fact that he is just not even willing to shoot the basketball, he's a terrible free throw shooter, that is obviously a huge concern. And he's on a massive contract. So I'm not really advocating that, oh, the Bulls must trade for Ben Simmons. But I think if his value is really low and you're able to trade not that much for him and you're willing to give up only so much, that it could potentially make sense. But I definitely get what you're saying as well. That it's like, this is a huge gamble because he's a liability at the end of the game. And do you really want someone like that as a liability at the end of the game? But I think his defense works for this team. The playmaking works for the team. Obviously, there are better point guard options. But I think if you strike out in free agency, I don't know. Who knows? That's just my viewpoint on it. But I get it. So many Bulls fans are in your camp. They're like, what are you saying, man? Like, well, Ben Simmons does not make sense for this team. Yeah. But anyway, based on what you know, though, or what you've heard recently, do you think that the Bulls will make big moves this offseason going into free agency? And what do you think is the most likely big move to happen?
Yeah, I definitely think they'll get a point guard. I mean, you have to. I mean, yeah, you got to get a point guard. The thing is with this front office, which I really, really love, is they're very sneaky. Nothing leaks from them. It's not like the previous regime. And the best example I give people about this front office compared to the other front office is, especially during this time with the draft coming up, with Gar Forman and John Paxson, when they were here, the Bulls would always release like posts on social media of group workouts that they've had with draft prospects. And with this front office, that's not happening. And that's the biggest thing that I look at it, that with the previous regime, they post that, oh, we worked out these players. With this front office, they keep everything on the low. So you never know with free agency what's going to happen. But I do really believe that they are going to get a point guard on the team. Who it's going to be, I'm not sure. But for me, I hope it's going to be Lonzo Ball because I think he'll bring a lot to the game. On the defensive side, I think he's very underrated. And I think on the offensive side, I think he'll really help out Zach Levine.
And you mentioned Lonzo Ball, and I think that's sort of the thing when we're kind of tying it back to Ben Simmons. It's like, if you're going to go that route and go all in on Ben Simmons, you might as well go with a guy like Lonzo Ball, who offers very similar skill sets, maybe not as, elite of defense as Ben Simmons does, but he's definitely a better offensive player. And obviously he's shown that, he's been able to improve his 3-point shooting specifically this past season. And you can get him for cheaper, right? Ben Simmons is on a very, very inflated contract. You can get Lonzo Ball for a cheaper rate, which I think you're right. That makes the most sense. Obviously, that's been the biggest talk, is like, that is the most likely point guard that the Bulls are going to get. You were kind of talking about the front office and how they really like to keep things under wraps. For you, because I feel like you're one of the first to really break news when it comes to the Bulls. How do you get your information so quickly, especially in this front office where they really just don't leak anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of a lot of different things. I do a lot of work like behind the scenes for my Twitter account because, in the beginning of my Twitter account, it was like kind of like a joke, like I said, like me sharing opinions. But then, like as the followers grew, and I feel like my responsibility is like a messenger. So if something is happening in Chicago sports, I want to be one of the first people to let that out to the fan base because they deserve it to know like what's true and what's not true. I always try to be like true on everything, make sure it's factual. And then if anything happens that I'm not sure, I don't tweet it out until, one of the big reporters, usually Casey Johnson, he does a really good job. So
Yeah.
he's one of the best just NBA reporters in general. So it's a lot of work behind the scenes. It's a lot of emails, like messages going back and forth with different people in the industry. But yeah, I try to be, especially with the Bulls, I've always had a strong passion for it. I want to be one of the first ones, especially for Bulls news.
Yeah, no, I mean you're great, man. You're my go-to. You
Appreciate
and
it.
Casey, and then a few others as well. It's like whenever I want to know what the latest news is, those are the feeds that I'm usually refreshing. So appreciate all your work on that. These over the past few years. Let's look back at this past season for a moment. What do you think was the biggest issue this team struggled with?
I think it was really the fourth quarter, like just second half in general. Don't know what happened in the locker room, but they blew so many leads, and it's just like it was so frustrating because they were just right there. A couple more wins, they could have gone to the play-in tournament, and they blew a lot of leads in the fourth quarter. I think there was like a stat with final like 5 minutes in the game, they were like one of the worst teams in blowing leads. So.
Yeah.
And with Zach Levine being on the COVID list, that also didn't help down the stretch. So I just think that they never really got to play together as a full. And then with the trade deadline, it just changed their whole style. They were more of like, let's give the ball to Nikola in the post and then bring it out. And then it's just like it's a whole different style with them in the first half and the second half. And then also them blowing leads and then with Zach being on the COVID list. There was just a lot of moving parts in. Especially this NBA season, it was very hard because of the COVID restrictions. So not a lot of practices. I believe they've only had one practice in the second half of the season. So it was very tough for them to just gel together and work as a team.
Yeah, you really hit it there because I know that Arturas kind of addressed that in his exit interview, was that there were just too many games that they gave away that they could have easily won, and it was late in game, specifically the fourth quarter. And those small games, just a few wins here and there, that's the difference between making the playoffs or not. And I do think that the way that the Bulls were trending, at least towards the end of the season, once Levine came back after he was cleared from the health and safety protocol, they looked decent, right? I mean, I'm not saying they looked like a title contending team by any means, but once Levine came back and Vucevic, he was out for like a few games and he also came back at the same time. They looked really good, and Coby White was finally starting to really find his stride when it came to, being a little bit of a better playmaker. He wasn't turning the ball over as frequently. He was taking smarter shots. I think if they had made the play-in tournament, they would have been able to advance into the playoffs. So, yeah, a lot of things to address. It's the turnovers, those fourth quarter, mental lapses that they just couldn't figure it out and close out games. So hopefully that's something that will be addressed this offseason and in free agency that will help them to go, improve going into next season. I'll end with sort of this question because I want to talk about Lauri Markkanen for a bit. Obviously, there are questions about his future, and I know we talked about it briefly at the beginning. Given the fact that he's going to be a restricted free agent, based on what you know right now, do you see him returning to the team? And as Arturas, throughout his time with the Bulls, he's maintained that his value, Lauri's value is there, and he sees him being a piece that's important to the roster. And I guess sort of a two-part question then, what are the chances of a signing trade, and how would that actually look like?
Yeah, so I would say there's always a chance he returns. You never know in free agency. But like when they didn't sign that extension with Lauri, in the beginning of the season, it kind of looked like, it wasn't happening with him.
Right.
I do think that there will be a sign and trade. I know they were talking with the Pelicans for Lonzo Ball in the trade deadline. And I always say when there's smoke in the NBA, there's fire. So I definitely think there will be a sign and trade with Lonzo Ball. I don't know what the pieces will be, but I just think it's just a perfect match for both teams, especially with the Bulls. But there's always a chance he returns, but you never know. But I definitely think that there will be a sign and trade with him and the Pelicans, or maybe another team. So I definitely think that they won't just let him go for free. I think there will be something in return.
Sure. And I know I said that was the last question, but I'm curious also about Thaddeus Young, Tomas Satoransky on partially guaranteed contracts. What do you think their future entails? And do you think that they might potentially waive them to free up that cap space that's going to be needed to bring in other free agents? Or do you think they'll fully guarantee their contracts on last years of their deals and bring them back to the team?
Yeah, so with Tomas Senerenski, really with him, like I know in the trade deadline there was several teams that called the Bulls interested in him.
Okay.
So I do know that I wouldn't be surprised if there's teams calling him like the Bulls again for him. He's a guy that a lot of people in the NBA see as a reliable point guard, a backup point guard, and also a leader in the team because he is a veteran. He's been through a lot. So I think, to be honest with you, I really like him as a backup point guard for the Bulls. You always need someone coming in with that second unit that knows the plays, that it's been there when if the other team is on a run, like he's a guy that slows down the pace, let's run through a play. I really like him as a player. I think him in the Olympics right now, you can see a lot of growth from him, and he's a guy that continues to get better. He's played in those physical games before, especially international. So I like him as a point guard, especially as a backup point guard. And with him and Thad Young, they're both leaders on the Bulls locker room. So I think it goes a long way, especially with Young. He was a huge locker room presence this past season. So I do see both of them coming back, but I also wouldn't be surprised if something happens with both of those players, either a trade or maybe a release. So again, you never know. With this Bulls front office, they're always very sneaky. So you always got to be open to anything.
Yeah, and you're right about Satoransky, is that he is a very valuable backup point guard, right? And I don't think that maybe he's necessarily a starting point guard in this league, although he was a decent one for the Bulls last season and even part of this season. And I think for Thaddeus Young, that leap that he made from being coached by Jim Boylan to now Billy Donovan, and just being that veteran presence, that high IQ player, that's a very versatile player, right? Like he really started upping his game in terms of his passing ability this season. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, because I do think that those are going to be some of the tougher decisions to make, whether to fully guarantee their contracts or fully guarantee it and then trade or waive them. I would obviously, love to see them back. I think the only thing with, Satoransky being a backup point guard, we were talking about Lonzo Ball or, whatever point guard that is, what's going to happen to Coby White,
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? I keep going on, but what do you think with Coby White, if we are to bring a point guard, a starting point guard, like Alonzo Ball or Spencer Dinwiddie, a player that's going to be an option or that's going to be available to the Bulls? What do you think happens to Coby White in that instance?
Well, here's what I'll say just in the Bulls, like the front office, is they're not here to mess around. They're not here for the rebuild year after year after year. They're trying to win. So they have that mindset, the mentality that let's go out there and every single season we're trying to win. We're trying to compete for a championship, not, we're going to try to tank like the previous regime. So with the future of Coby White, the injury that he had off court, that really just I believe killed the offseason for him, because this was a huge offseason for him to train and grow as an individual and also as a player. But he had I guess that tryout this past season at the point guard position. There were some ups and there was also a lot of downs. But for me, I think you have to get a point guard that knows what they're doing, a traditional point guard, a point guard that's comfortable, a point guard that will get your team ready, and a point guard that is that leader in your team, not just on the court, but also off the court. But I definitely see that Coby White as a big player and a big contributor on the team this upcoming season. But I look at him more as like a Ben Gordon type of player to me.
Sure. Yeah, I know a lot of people have said that as well, right? Just like a good, solid scorer on the team that can get you some buckets. So, Daniel, really appreciate the time, man. We could stay in touch, and you can keep me posted on all the latest news that's going on. Keep up the great work with the Twitter account, and appreciate the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, and go Bulls.
Go Bulls. All right. Take care, buddy.